So welcome to the final talk. It's a great privilege for me to be here today, marking this remarkable man, William Thomson. And I'm thrilled at the fact that I've managed to bring Joe Goddard from University of California, San Diego, to speak today. First met Joe 25 years ago in a cafe outside the UCSD library, where I would hang out and calculate. In the Scottish Enlightenment tradition, where others gather for coffee and have open discussions, I got to know Joe and his colleagues, all scientists who would gather for wonderful chats on science and other matters. And to put some context here quickly, I introduced Joe to some thermodynamic notions, the use of differential forms for thermodynamics as a way of treating it. And some 25 years later, I find myself amazed and very happy to see that Joe's made great discoveries and progress utilizing this type of technology. And in putting this meeting together, when I looked up Joe, I discovered indeed he'd gone as far as to write a paper on William Thomson, unprovoked by me, but just simply as a legacy of this. So indeed, all things have come around full circle, and it's an incredible pleasure to be here to do this. So let me tell you a little bit about Joe. He received his Bachelor of Science from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in '57, and his PhD in Chemical Engineering from UC Berkeley in 1962. He joined the Chemical Engineering faculty at the University of Michigan in 1963, and in 1976 accepted the position of Floor Professor and Chair in the Department of Chemical Engineering at University of Southern California, Los Angeles. He has then been professor at UCSD, University of California, San Diego, since '91, and emeritus recalled to research since 2016. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking the LMS and the organizers of this marvelous symposium. I want to particularly thank Stephen Watson for being a gracious host and helping me with some difficulties I had getting here. Before I came, I had read an article by Dr. McCartney. I didn't realize he would be here, and I was delighted to see that. He wrote an article in a popular physics journal called William Thomson, King of Victorian Science. And I couldn't agree more with that assessment. At the same time, I have to say that this reduces me with Kelvin's 600 or so published works. I'm reduced to the stature of a pauper. And so I ask myself, what tribute can a pauper give to a king? And of course, since time immemorial, it's everything he has. So you're going to see what I have to offer. Like many people who've worked in mechanics, I'm familiar with works of Kelvin and mechanics and have used some of the results. But the subject I'm talking about today has nothing to do with any past research of mine in mechanics. It came about from some 40 years or more of trying to teach thermodynamics to undergraduates in chemical and mechanical engineering. Whenever I talk, I've decided I would try to cover thermoelectricity because it's very, very interesting now technologically. I always resorted to chemical thermodynamics and a kind of reduced form of William Thomson's thermodynamics, which I'd gotten from secondary sources. I'd never read the original papers of William Thomson. Well, eventually I discovered there's a huge contradiction in the literature. As opposed to Thomson's equilibrium thermodynamics, there's a completely non-equilibrium thermodynamics. And in my view, this represents a controversy which exists, as far as I know, down to the present time. So I want to tell you about that, and I want to show you that there may be a way out of the dilemma. So that's the subject of my talk. I've listed 3 references here. The first is putting Thomson's thermodynamics into modern terms. He knew all this, I think, but he just didn't have the language at the time for the thermodynamics. Then the second 2 references are aimed at clearing up the contradiction that I referred to. So I'd like to offer a critique of various challenges to Thomson's theory by some distinguished people. And then I'd like to show that you can reconcile Thomson and Onsager by means of Edelin's dissipation potentials for strictly irreversible processes and Maxwell's relaxation time, the idea of relaxation. And then with some conclusions if I have time. So let me quickly run through the modern treatment of thermoelectricity. This is an edifice erected decades later on the foundations laid by William Thomson in thermodynamics, where he straightened everything out, the first law, second law, and so forth. And it's not having modern thermodynamics at his disposal. He worked out thermoelectricity. He realized immediately that thermoelectricity could be treated by thermodynamics just like the conversion of heat mechanically to mechanical work. The conversion of heat to electrical work was governed by the same principles. And he in fact used Carnot's theorems to get the result by a completely tour de force application of the theorems. It is a head breaker to read this, but he knew what he was doing. So I'll run through this very quickly. This is more or less based on the modern rational thermodynamics of Bernard Coleman and his associates. This particular formulation is due to, it's a modification of something Morton Girton did, and with some differences. So we have the internal energy balance, which involves stress work, heat addition at a point, and then now we have to add heat that flows with electricity. So this is electronic enthalpy times electrical current. And then we have another form of external work due to external potential. And this is the usual way of including radiation. We just forget that. We'll set that equal to 0. In my opinion, it can always be put here with Q. The reason there are different forms is I might have chosen to put Q and this term together. And that would make sense with metallic conductors because the electrons carry a lot of the heat transfer. But it doesn't make sense with more general semiconductors and so forth. So we can think of this as heat associated with a matrix and this with the current flow. And then the second law takes this form, but the entropy flux is the usual 1 plus the entropy associated with the flow of electricity. Electricity carries thermodynamic properties. And so it's only a few of these symbols you'll have to remember. And so you get the Helmholtz free energy balance and as an inequality where this is the Helmholtz, this is the Helmholtz free energy. This is the Gibbs free energy of electronic free energy. I'll mention it below how it's derived. And then this is the total electrical potential, the Gibbs electrical potential plus the external. And I put this down because if we have a heterojunction between 2 different metals or the thermoelectric materials, then this mu represents a kind of affinity in the two separate metals, which is not the same. And so we'll have a jump in this, but this is assumed to be continuous. So a jump in affinity between the two conductors leads to a jump in potential. It creates, and that's the thermocouple effect. One of the reasons I wrote this paper was to look at the effect of stress. And so in that case, one postulate, a constitutive equation, would be that the Helmholtz free energy depends on a stretch tensor defined in continuum mechanics this way. And you can break the deformation down into isotropic and shear, and you come up with various useful relations that I've written down here, where this partial derivative is the derivative with respect to specific charge per unit mass. The Lagrange conjugate to psi is the Gibbs free energy written down here. And this is what you need to do this to get piezo thermoelectricity effective stress on thermoelectric materials. Thomson realized that. He took copper wires made of the same copper. He stretched one and touched it to the other, and he got a potential. So he basically conceived the field of piezo thermoelectricity without much ado. So now you can get very interesting results in modern terms. If you take the energy balance for undeforming material, and it reduces down to what's left here. And at surfaces of discontinuity, we can replace the divergence in the usual way with discontinuities. And we come up with the Peltier effect. The Peltier heat at a heterojunction involves the jump in heat, which was liberated at the junction, plus the current flow through the junction. And so you come up with something that's totally obvious in modern terms, that the heat effect is the absolute temperature times the change in entropy, the jump in entropy at the heterojunction. And you get a connection to the Seebeck effect, which has to do with the temperature, and it comes out being that expression. The Thomson effect, it occurs when we have just these terms. This is Thomson's expression. He recognized that electric current had energy associated with it, had a specific heat. So he refers to the specific heat of electricity. This is before they knew anything about electrons carrying energy and so forth. Again, amazing. If you put in linear isotropic resistivity and you add the work terms, the electrical loss, then you get this interesting formula that the heat output input at a point involves two terms. One is the Thomson effect, which is convection of that's this term here, convection of electronic enthalpy. And then we have this term, which is Joule heating. I could almost quit here, and with this expression, we'll see a slightly general form of it in a moment. It says everything, basically. So I made a tableau here translating all Thomson's relations on the left into modern terms. The Thomson coefficient is nothing more than the specific heat of electricity. of electronic specific heat, and so forth. You can derive all of his relations over here, and you see them over here, and included is the Carnot efficiency term. So he got all these correct by this reasoning on the Carnot principle. Okay, well, after his theory, he was even worried about whether you could separate reversible from irreversible effects, equilibrium from non-equilibrium effects. So there are some nagging doubts leading to the dictum of Rochefoucauld. There goes another theory about to be murdered by a gang of brutal facts. And I insist, it's not the facts that are brutal here, it's the gang, the very distinguished gang who have, in my opinion, gotten it wrong. Boltzmann immediately is seeing Thomson's theory. This is translated from the German. He says the theory is so beautifully self-contained that the possibility of complete consistency with the facts cannot be denied. Then he goes on to model a circuit with known materials. I think it was bismuth and antimony. He set up a model. He hooked it up and let her rip. He short-circuited it and then says, you can't get rid of irreversibilities. What he didn't envision is that he could have put in that circuit a little device to extract electrical work to slow down the current and approach a thermostatic state. It is very, Thomson had already said in his papers that he laid down this ansatz. He says the heat effect, say loss to the surroundings, has two terms, one that's linear in the current and one that's quadratic. This represents the reversible term. If I change the current direction, I change heat absorption to heat rejection and vice versa. This term, the irreversible part, is always positive. It's the Joule heating. And it's funny that Thomson didn't realize, maybe he did, but he didn't care, I don't know. He didn't realize that he could have refuted arguments and questions about irreversibility by arguing that you can slow things down and approach the thermodynamic equilibrium state, or sometimes called thermostatic state. So this is, as I said, I could practically stop here and say that answers the question, but there's some issues about symmetry that I have to explore and tell you about. Bridgman pointed out later that he didn't think it invalidated Boltzmann's, Thomson's theory, but he didn't explain very clearly why. So now Onsager, apparently emboldened by Thomson's reservations and Boltzmann's analysis, treated the whole process as strictly irreversible and came up with a linear model where you have a flux J and a force X. I'll use that notation, Onsager's notation, connected by a symmetric positive definite conductance with resistance, which is the inverse. And this gives you a dissipation, the force times the flux, which is non-zero. It's positive definite. He didn't go on to offer a detailed treatment. He left it to others to sort of do the dirty work, to jettison Thomson's theory. And it's a remarkable story how many people got on the bandwagon here. So I've made a list of the people involved. Over on the left We have two Nobel Prize winners, Bridgman and Neville Mott. On the right, we have one Nobel Prize winner, Onsager, and Arnold Sommerfeld, who was not, he didn't win the prize. He holds the record of the most nominated. He was nominated 74 times. And his students got the prize, several of his students, but he's one of my favorite people. And one of his books on physics occupy a prominent place on my bookshelf. And that's where I read some of his analysis. But the strange thing is, he starts off, he gives us Thomson's theory, then immediately by a huge discontinuity, he jumps to Onsager. So he went from reversible to irreversible, completely irreversible in one fell swoop. Sommerfeld also made some funny quips at one that I like about teaching thermodynamics. He said, the first time you teach the subject, you don't understand anything. The second time you teach the subject, you think maybe you're beginning to understand. And the third time you teach the subject, you realize it doesn't matter. I think what he means is there's a seductive formalism. I was unaware until Dr. McCartney's talk that Thomson had referred to neat formulae. And in mathematical physics, this is quite common for people to use neat formulae without really having a firm grasp of the foundations. So I want to try to reconcile these opposing points of view by using the idea of dissipation potential. A great applied mathematician, in my opinion, greatly underestimated, a student of Jerry Ericsson's, developed using exterior calculus a generalization of Rayleigh and Onsager quadratic dissipation or linear forms with this set of relations. If I have a purely strictly dissipative process, which is this is greater than or equal to 0, this pairing or scalar product, this defines the dissipation rate. And if I have only inequality, I'll call that strongly dissipative. So we have two terms. Flux is given by the derivative of a force potential plus an extra term, and the force is given by a flux potential, the derivative, and with, again, an extra term. These extra terms are non-dissipative, or I like to call them gyroscopic, by analogy to the effect of electric field on current flow, the Lorentz force that gives rise to the Hall effect and destroys Onsager's symmetry in the linear case. So if those terms are absent, those non-dissipative terms, and Edelin shows how you get them from the flux as a function of force or the force as a function of flux. I'm going to stick with mainly with this representation, with this term not here. So when those terms are absent, we'll call it strongly dissipative. There, the force is given by the derivative of a potential, subscript d, meaning a dissipation. And so we have symmetry in the nonlinear case just because the cross derivatives of a potential are symmetric second derivatives. The analog is what's sometimes called Maxwellian symmetry in equilibrium thermodynamic systems, where we have a displacement. I've called it Q here. And we have this kind of symmetry, again, because of the existence of a thermodynamic equilibrium potential. Many years ago, I heard a lecture by the late, great George Batchelor from Cambridge University, and he wondered if there was any relation between these effects. I cannot remember where the lecture was, and nobody at Cambridge knows because George didn't keep a record of his talks. So I'm perhaps the only living person who knows about George Metzler's question, but I think I can provide an answer to it. So giving a talk on the subject some time ago, it seemed reasonable to give a pictorial representation over here in what we could call solid elasticity or equilibrium thermodynamics. We have Angeli's depiction of Elijah returning to heaven from which he came in his chariot of fire. And on the right, we have Hieronymus Bosch's picture of the other place where everything is lost. The interesting thing is there's a parallel relations between these potentials. If they lose convexity, we have material instability, either purely dissipated or equilibrium thermodynamic, which would correspond to phase changes. Dr. Ball would know about, Professor Ball would know about all that. We have shear banding, phase transitions, and so forth. So what could be the relation? Well, recently with my young colleague, Ken Cameron, who just left MIT to go to UC Berkeley, we came up with the idea that based on some literature having to do with breakup of biomolecular networks under stretching with instantaneous rehealing. So you have breakage, rehealing, and you dissipate energy at an elastic stress level. And so the postulate here is, at least as an approximation, that if I have equilibrium potential, thermodynamic potential as a function of displacement related to the flux in this way, then I'll say that the dissipation potential is some equivalent displacement, which will take place over some time period, a relaxation time period tau. This is Maxwell's idea. And so what comes out of this is the derivative of this potential. It gives the dissipation, and that turns out to be exactly the elastic force evaluated at this displacement. This gives Maxwell's relation between viscosity and elasticity. According to this point of view, there are really no dissipative parameters. They all follow from equilibrium forces and relaxation times. So the viscosity, Maxwell's in his model, the viscosity is simply the relaxation time times the elasticity. And that holds whether we're talking about scalar or tensor viscosity and elasticity. So this needs further work. I'm not completely happy with this treatment, but I think it captures the essential idea. So according to the present view, Onsager symmetry, which is sometimes touted as being the fourth law of thermodynamics, is not really a new law. It's a consequence of Maxwellian symmetry of the equilibrium situation, the elastic situation, and it's inherent in the relaxation, which is associated with second law of thermodynamics. So, what about a combination of effects? Well, we come back to Kelvin. This is the Kelvin void model of a viscoelastic solid. We have a spring, which is the equilibrium force, in parallel with a dashpot, which is the dissipative force. And if I have the combination here, the force is the sum of the two forces, but they're both given by the equilibrium force relation. First given in terms of this flux, And so we wind up with everything being given by the equilibrium Helmholtz free energy. And of course, in a complicated system, we can think of a network of these things, each with its displacements, fluxes, and disparate relaxation times. So we can, in the simplest case, the thermoelectricity, we basically have two processes. We have an electric displacement or current flow, and we have a thermal displacement or current flow. We have heat flow. So we have two modes. And if we look at the conservation equation, the field equations for the conservation of charge and thermal energy, we come up with these relations. This is basically a Gauss's equation for the, in the case of electricity, it's Gauss's equation for giving the dielectric displacement in terms of the charge density. In the case of thermal, we have the thermal density, the enthalpy density given by this expression for unstressed conductors. So there are now two relaxation times. One that can be identified as the electric permittivity divided by the conductivity, the electrical conductivity, or I can say the electrical conductivity is, which is a dissipative parameter, it's given in terms of this epsilon divided by the relaxation time. So again, the dissipative parameter doesn't stand on its own, it comes from someplace else. In the case of the thermal, I think there's a new concept involved here that we can talk about thermal displacement. In the paper I just referred to, we didn't quite get that, I didn't quite get that right. I took the thermal and the electrical displacement to be involved simply the gradient of temperature and potential. So this is the correct form, but we need this concept of thermal displacement. You might think of that as a very poor conductor that could support a thermal gradient, a very poor thermal conductor that would relax over time. Or you could think of a conductor in which we can create some temperature gradient. So that's something that needs perhaps much more validity, verification. If we don't have such a foundation for that, you could simply take the thermal relaxation time to be proportional to the electrical relaxation time. Something like this is done in Maxwell's kinetic theory of gases, where there is a mechanical relaxation time associated with viscoelastic response. There's also a thermal relaxation time associated with memory-dependent heat conduction, and one is a multiple of the other. So what the multiple should be is not clear. So there's a rudimentary field theory worked out in the third reference, and it shows thermoelectricity to be essentially with both diffusional and convection effects. It turns out to be an analog to a fluid mechanical transport process. The equilibrium case corresponds to the case where diffusion, that is heat conduction or electrical conduction, becomes less important, and it's all convection, the movement of electricity. So it's the regime of what's sometimes called the large Peclet number. And I think with proper amendment, the theory can be extended to semiconductors where we now have electrons and holes, or more complicated situations where we have different kinds of charge carriers. So, conclusions. I'll give you lots of time for questions, but unfortunately I'm deaf, so. Thomson's thermoelectricity translates seamlessly into modern thermodynamics without question. And it also identifies what are otherwise arcane coefficients that are drawn from experiment, and it gives those in terms of standard thermodynamic properties. The challenges from Boltzmann and Onsager and the uncritical acceptance of Onsager's formalism, I think, have obscured the perfectly valid foundations of Thomson's thermoelectricity. So I feel that with more work on this, and I certainly invite people who are interested to get involved, we can progress to new theories and applications and devices. I have colleagues now that are doing work on thermoelectric materials, semiconductor, solid state thermoelectric devices. And they don't use this. They use empirical relations to give improved performance, things based on thermal conductivity and electrical conductivity criteria that allow them to improve the performance. So I think with the proper field theory, this can all be done correctly, and I think that's totally in keeping with the spirit of Kelvin. So there are lots of questions in the modeling, because in conductors, really the charge is not in the interior, it's on the surface. So when I talk about charge per unit mass, it's charge per surface area and surface area per unit mass, with the approximation of thin wires and so forth. So there's a lot of work here to do the proper boundary conditions in a field theory. And there's one large mystery, is where do these non-dissipative forces come from? In the case of thermoelectricity, you can associate them with magnetic fields and the Hall effect. In other situations, it's not at all clear what the origin is, whether it's some kind of constraint. So this is something that troubles me greatly, and I haven't been able to come to any conclusions. So here are some of the possible applications. Vibration enhanced thermoelectric devices, which is already being studied experimentally, where have oscillatory stress. Okay, well, let me finish there with a picture others have shown. I show this because it kind of makes a personal connection. I was, for a time, owner of a sailboat, which was approximately 1/12 the size of this sailboat. Not only could I not pay for it with consulting fees the way Thomson did, I couldn't sail it very well. I bought it to live on, and so it just caused me to reflect. I was wondering if William Thomson actually became an accomplished seaman. Maybe somebody who knows his biography better than me will know whether he was both owner and captain of that ship. I'm owner and captain of my ship, but it doesn't go very far. Anyway, thank you very much for your. I lost a small microphone that I could have passed around. So you'll have to give them to Stephen, and I'm beginning to understand what he says. So I'll try to answer through him.
Very, very kind. So plenty of time for questions. And again, we'll let Joe receive the question, and if he's able to digest it, but otherwise I'll try and relay some of that at closer quarters. So the room is open for questions.
That is both good and bad.
One here.
Am I correct in thinking that thermoelectricity is primarily a quantum effect? So all of this theory was done before quantum mechanics, and so it's remarkable if it is.
What's the question? So he's wanting you to look at quantum effects, viewing the quantum should play a role, quantum mechanics should play a role.
Important?
No, quantum mechanics.
Oh,
should
quantum
play a role.
mechanics. Well, this is all
This is a
classical mechanics. Of course, electronic phenomena in small wires and conductors are governed by quantum mechanics. So, but I don't think we have to worry about that. It shows up. It shows up as in a kind of classical continuum way, as long as you stay at that level. There have been talks here where people have talked about more mesoscopic or microscopic. If you wanted to do something like that, then clearly you might have some quantum mechanical effects. But I don't see that as the first challenge. Maybe people who design solid state devices would be interested in what the connection is between quantum mechanics and continuum mechanics.
Any other questions? John.
You talk about things like liquid crystal elastomers that interact with light.
So liquid crystal elastomers.
Crystal elastomer.
Yeah, liquid crystal elastomers.
Oh, no, I haven't.
And the interaction with light.
Pardon?
And their interaction with light.
Any connection?
And their interaction with light.
Interaction with light. Oh, you mean the radiation term, for example? Should I do something with that for liquid crystals, photoactive liquid crystals? No, I haven't thought about that. You can put, there's an interesting question as to how you should treat radiation. It's done formally by Truesdell in that school by putting it in as a source term. But actually I've written a paper recently with a very talented colleague from Ben Gurion University showing that radiation is just another form of Cauchy flux, and you can treat radiation as a flux. And so that would be the approach I would recommend for photoactive crystalline materials, is to look at the dynamic. Chandrasekhar and all these people worked out the dynamics of radiation interacting with matter. So yeah, you could do something there, but I can't. You could probably do it.
Any other questions? So maybe I'll take an opportunity to ask a question. So today,
See, I can pretend I don't understand it now.
so today we heard a lot about active matter.
Yeah.
And the non-equilibrium thermodynamics of active matter. And you're arguing that perhaps this area is still classical thermodynamics to some extent. So where does active matter go beyond this?
I take the perhaps overarching view, too much overarching, that with active matter, you have metabolism feeding energy into the system, and it's a question of what you do with it afterwards. I don't think the thermodynamics, maybe in terms of interpretation people were talking about, if you regard it as strictly dissipative, then you might use the idea of dissipation potentials to some advantage in doing dynamics of swimmers and so forth. But I really don't have very clear ideas on the subject. So I think the interest may be in the dynamics of pattern formation and the things we've seen here today, crystalline form being formed, crystalline structure, or aggregates, solid aggregates being formed. That's dynamics, and I don't see to what extent thermodynamics comes in except as some kind of restriction on the constitutive equations that you use to describe the dynamics of active matter. Yeah.
So any last minute questions? So if not, let's thank Joe for closing it up.